2 years later, this tragedy will call for a 72nd victim.
If any of the just mentioned factors would have gone just slightly different, this accident would have never happened.
Charlie, taxi to holding point, runway 23 left, right, taxi was Echo Bravo and Alpha, wind 0908 knots, QNH 1008, will hold short, runway 23 left.
Charlie, runway 22 left, clear for takeoff.
Welcome to the first episode of Air Incidents Podcast. We are a podcast talking about aviation incidents and accidents. This episode will be released together with our introduction episode, so I'm not going to talk about that too much. If you're interested in that, just listen to the introduction episode. There we pretty much tell you everything about what this podcast is all about. So without further delay, I want to introduce to you my co-host. She is a professional podcaster and blogger. She has her own podcast in Germany. Some say she does a half marathon before breakfast. Others believe she is the next lyricist superstar. Ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm welcome to our half Finnish and half German co-host. Hello, First Officer Sarah.
Hello. Beautiful introduction.
I know. How are you today?
I'm very good. I would say spring is finally here in Germany, and I've been sitting on my balcony the whole day, and I just enjoyed it, finally, after this very, very long winter.
Well, I believe spring is finally there in southern Germany, because here in central Germany, close to the Netherlands border, it's like windy and stormy and everything.
Is it?
Yeah, it's terrible. It was actually hailing yesterday.
What?
Just a little bit for just a couple of minutes, but
So
yeah, weather is not really enjoyable right now.
we see again that you live in the wrong place, in the wrong corner of Germany, and I live at the best spot, of course.
Well,
Yeah,
I have like three supermarkets right off my front door. How about you?
I might have to drive a little.
There you go. there you go.
But seriously, I don't mind to do that as long as I have better weather.
Yeah, you live near Stuttgart. I think everything is said with that. Whatever. Enough making fun of each other. If you like us talking nonsense about locations in Germany, and if you maybe even like the way we talk about aviation, you can support us if you want to do that. We do have two opportunities of supporting us. We are on Patreon. Most of you guys know Patreon. It's a support platform for people who do things like podcasts, videos, music, and all that. And we created several subscription packages there. So if you want to check that out, please visit patreon.com/aircrashpodcast. That'd be great. If you do want to support us but do not really want to make some kind of subscription or something, we also have a PayPal address, which is www.paypal.me/aircrashpodcast. For those of you wondering why the name of our Patreon and PayPal accounts is differing from our show name, that is because this podcast also exists in German, even for a little longer, and yeah, we just adapted those accounts and didn't create new ones. With that being said, so let's get to today's topic of this episode. We are going to talk about the Überlingen air collision in Germany, a topic we obviously chose for our first episode because it kind of connects what we do to Germany. It's one of the worst accidents that happened over German soil. So yeah, this is what we're going to talk about. It's a little bit of a tough one here, I have to admit that. It's a really sad story. For now, Sarah is just gonna give us a quick overview of what happened on that dreadful day. Sarah, please.
July 1st, 2002, 8 p.m. local time, Zurich, Switzerland. 3 controllers start their shift at Skyguide Area Control, an ATC that is, amongst others, responsible for the southern German airspace. One of the controllers has duties that night which are not related to active air traffic control. Besides the 2 controllers who are starting their duty time, there are also 10 technicians in the building who do maintenance work on the systems. Therefore, some components have to be shut down. Same evening, 6:48 p.m. local time, Moscow, Russia. A Bashkirian Airlines Tupolev Tu-154 is departing for a 4-hour and 20-minute trip to Barcelona as Bashkirian Tu-937. Among the 69 passengers and crew are 20 highly talented children aged between 8 and 16 years. They won the trip for outstanding achievements in education. The class was supposed to leave for Barcelona the day before, but the bus driver got lost in Moscow, which eventually resulted in a missed flight. The plane is just about to enter Czech airspace when DHL Flight 611 is departing in Bergamo bound for Brussels. Zurich, 9:15 p.m. One of the 2 active controllers at Skyguide takes a break. Due to their shift policy, he will spend most of his shift on standby, leaving the other controller in sole responsibility for the southern German airspace. At 11:15 p.m., a delayed Airbus A320 bound for Friedrichshafen contacts Friedrichshafen approach, a frequency that is also covered by Skyguide. The controller on duty was not aware of the delay, as the plane was originally due before his shift even started. He now has to fully focus on this approach before he can hand the plane to the tower of the airport. At 11:30 p.m., disaster is about to strike. Both Bashkirian 2937 and DHL 611 are at flight level 360 and their paths will cross over Lake Constance. The controller, busy with Friedrichshafen approach, is unaware of that situation. TCAS, a mandatory collision avoidance system, goes off in both planes, and both crews are aware of the conflict from that moment on and take action. Nevertheless, the 2 planes collide. For both aircraft, there is no chance of survival. 71 people lose their lives. 2 years later, on February 24, 2004, this tragedy will call for a 72nd victim.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much for that great narrative. This accident is really a complex one. There are many different aspects we want to look into today. We're going to start with air traffic control, then we're going to have a closer look into the so-called TCAS system and the conduct of both of the crews. After all those details, we obviously are going to talk about the aftermath a little bit as well.
Yeah, let's just start with the situation at the responsible air traffic control center that night, as this collision is extremely connected to air traffic control. The ATC that controlled both aircraft involved was located in Zurich, Switzerland, and was operated by a privately owned company called Skyguide. At the time of interest, 3 controllers were on duty, 2 of 3 were active, while 1 was assigned work that was not related to actual controlling. This was nothing unusual and appropriate for night traffic in the controlled airspace. In fact, the duty regulation was that one of the 2 active controllers will go on standby duty shortly after the shift starts and stays on standby in a recreation room provided by the company. This means that from 9:15 p.m. on, 1 controller was solely responsible for the airspace. This fateful night, though, was a bit different, as there was maintenance work going on, and some of the systems used by the traffic controllers were not available.
Yeah, there were quite a number of systems affected by this maintenance work. It was necessary to work with the so-called fallback mode, which basically means that only basic systems like primary radar and aircraft identification systems are available. I'm just going to list 2 of the inoperative systems for now, because the other ones were not really relevant for this accident. So those two in-op systems were the SWI-02, which, among other things, does control the landline telephones, and the STCA. This stands for Short-Term Conflict Alert System and is a backup control that acoustically and visually tells air traffic controllers that two aircraft are coming close to each other.
Yeah, and as far as my understanding goes, it is normal and perfectly acceptable to shut down the systems for maintenance, especially when done at night with a lower number of flights. In Europe and specifically in Germany, many airports cease operations at night due to local regulations. Most of the occurring traffic is transit and cargo, and the workload is way lower than during daytime. However, there was an issue with the way the controllers were informed about the fallback mode, as they actually were not. Well, at least not in person. SkyGuide distributed important messages as self-briefings, meaning they were posted as a printed bulletin, and it was in the controller's responsibility to read that.
Yeah, that pretty much sums up the situation at Skyline. Thank you very much for that. As Sarah mentioned, one of the only two controllers on duty went on standby shortly after they both started their shift at 9 p. Now, to understand what happened here, you want to know that SkyGuide was also responsible for the approach frequency of Friedrichshafen Airport, which is a smaller German airport right at the Swiss border. This kind of becomes important as things started to go south at around 11:20 p.m. By the way, we're talking local time here, which is UTC +1. An Airbus A320 contacted Friedrichshafen approach. At this time, there was no more planned landings into this airport. The A320 was delayed several hours and originally due for landing before the current controller shift even started. Normally, in a case like this, the airport does call ATC through landline and informs them of the new estimated time of arrival. But remember, with the shutdown of the SWI-02 system, landline was not operational and therefore the call simply did not go through. Now, this alone is not too much of an issue, but the controller had to take his full attention towards this approach. Interestingly, the controller tried to call the airport as well to get information on this plane. Now, that is interesting because it may be an indication that he wasn't fully aware of what systems were in op at the time.
Yes, and coincidentally, at the same time, disaster developed in the same area on flight level 360. The DHL 757 and the Bashkirian TU 154 were closing in on each other at the exactly same altitude. The controller obviously was not aware of that, as he was busy with the delayed approach. This alone would not have caused the tragedy that was about to happen. Some more things had to go completely wrong. Firstly, the situation was monitored in another ATC in Karlsruhe. This one that controls the adjacent northern sector did realize that the two planes were on collision course. A controller there tried to contact Zurich, but again, the landline did not go through for known reasons. But even after that, there still was a last-minute safety system that could and should have avoided the collision. The traffic collision avoidance system. Now, I did not know what this was until I joined this podcast, but in our German version, we already covered 2 accidents in which this either played a role or was something to talk about. Now I understand that the system is monitoring the position of all surrounding aircrafts and automatically gives out so-called resolution advisories. So what I found out by doing research was that there was sent a collision alarm in both cockpits, but the Bashkirian Airlines crew was confused because the air traffic controller gave them other instructions.
Well, here it gets a little bit complicated. To understand what happened next, we kind of have to jump around between the aircraft and ATC a little bit. As we have not talked about the situation in the aircraft at all yet, I think we should do that first to keep track of what happened. We now had a good look at the situation in ATC. Let's have a closer look into what TCAS is, as this is really important here. And then have a closer look at both aircraft before we bring it all together, if you will. Sarah, you explained TCAS pretty well already. I do not want to add too much. The system is mandatory for every civilian passenger aircraft with more than 30 seats, and yeah, you can simply say it works really, really well. It uses the plane's own transponder and monitors transponders of other planes around it, so it's completely self-sufficient and does not need any assistance from ground-based equipment. If two planes are on collision course within defined close distances, both will receive a unique advisory to resolve the issue. If one plane gets a descent advisory, the other will automatically receive an order to climb. So if both crews immediately react and do what TCAS orders, the situation will immediately be resolved. Today it is clarified that TCAS advisories are superseding air traffic control at all times. Back in 2002, this was only a recommendation, even though the system itself became mandatory in the US back in 1993 and in Europe back in 2000. This will play an important role in the case.
I have a question about the TCAS. At what distance does the TCAS start to send an alarm to both cockpits? Like how many miles or kilometers?
Well, this may be a little bit different. In general, it's like as soon as the separation is not given anymore. So in that area, the separation distance between two airplanes is 5 nautical miles. That means that as soon as two aircraft get closer than 5 nautical miles on a collision course, it will go off. Now, we're talking pretty high speeds here. Obviously, 5 nautical miles is not too much of a distance. We get into this just a little later, but
Okay.
I tell you right now, in this particular case, it was about 50 seconds before the actual crash happened.
Which is quite late. But yeah, okay, let's talk about that later. Yeah, so let's have a closer look at the involved aircraft first. The Bashkirian flight was en route to Barcelona. The airline operations required 2 instructed flights for every captain to fly into this airport. For the captain of this flight, it was his second instructed flight to Barcelona. So he was in the left seat with an instructor in the right seat. Then there was a flight engineer and the actual co-pilot in the back seats of the cockpit, with the co-pilot not having any duties on the flight. The crew was highly experienced, and the captain had logged over 12,000 and the instructor 8,500 flight hours at the time. The DHL flight only had 2 crew on board, the captain with 11,900 flight hours and the first officer with 6,600 hours at the time. As far as we know, both crews were completely unaware of the situation until the TCAS advisory came up 50 seconds before the collision. Okay, I'm sorry, but at this point I have to come back to the 50 seconds. I mean, that's such a short time. Is there not any possibility to change it? I mean, 50 seconds, that's nothing. I cannot imagine that any pilot can react in such a short time and change something about the situation.
Well, Sarah, there has been more than one question, but I tried to answer all of them. Your question, if there is a chance to make that timely distance any longer, the simple answer to it is no, there's not.
Why?
The reason why there is... Yeah, I was just about to tell you that. The reason why it is not possible is, especially in Europe, and I can only talk for Europe here, is the air traffic itself. There's so much traffic in Europe that if TCAS would go off before 2 airplanes fall below separation, it pretty much would go off all the time. So this is really like the traffic we have kind of gives that separation we're talking about here. And then you said you can't imagine that a pilot can react within 50 seconds. Technically, those 50 seconds are more than enough time. Like the usual TCAS resolution advisory is always one plane is instructed to climb and the other one is instructed to descend. This can pretty much be done in no time. And it's not that much of a height difference you need in between the planes that they pass each other. You know, I mean, if TCAS comes into play, something went wrong in before. If that makes sense to you. So at this time, like a couple of seconds before TCAS went off, both flights were absolutely normal. It was close to midnight, the weather is nice, and both planes were at cruising altitude. So it kind of was another day in the office for the crews. Nothing too special. The German investigation board later stated that both aircraft were very well maintained and in great technical condition. Yeah, there was just nothing wrong. At the time, however, the TCAS resolution advisory came up. The Skyguide controller still was not aware of the situation, but he realized what was going on shortly after. Now, for those last 50 seconds, we will just stay in a chronological order because so many things happened at the same time. Just as a side note, if you will, I want to say that at the time of the following, the co-pilot of the 757 was not in the cockpit. He came back immediately after TCAS went off. Now again, this was at cruise altitude. It's perfectly normal for one of the crew to leave the cockpit in this phase of the flight. The advisory for the DHL 757 was descent, to which the crew immediately complied. The recommended sink rate for TCAS advisories is 2,500 to 3,000 feet per minute. However, the 757 went into a 2,300 feet per minute descent. They also informed ATC about the TCAS alert, but this information was not registered there. In the Tupolev, the TCAS went off at exactly the same time. Just 7 seconds later, the ATC controller became aware of the situation and contacted Bashkirian 2937 with instructions to immediately descend to 35,000 or flight level 350. Then there was a short discussion in the cockpit about the differing instructions of TCAS and the controller. The instructions of the ATC were not read back, but followed immediately. A second call by ATC was also then immediately confirmed by the crew.
And one more question about the TCAS. I was wondering if this alarm comes up, is that a moment where the pilot gets panicked, or is that something that might happen from time to time?
I do believe that most of the pilots in the air never had a live TCAS advisory while they were flying. However, that's not the question here. This is highly trained in simulator training and all that. And it's one of those items where you just start to function and start to do what you learned. So I don't think anybody panics when this goes off. It definitely is an unusual situation, though. That this is something most careers probably simply never experience. Okay. So back to the situation. Both planes were in a severe situation as they both descended, and therefore the situation was not resolved. To make it worse, the information the controller gave the Tupolev was wrong, as he said traffic 2 o'clock right. We do not know why he did that. Most likely he just confused the aircraft with each other, as the DHL was not in 2 o'clock right, but in 10 o'clock left. So if you look at the situation from the DHL perspective, the Tupolev indeed was at 2 o'clock right. This led to the Bashkirian crew searching for the incoming traffic on the wrong side, where they were obviously not able to find it.
Now in this phase, we are seconds away from contact. There was a lot of confusion going on. Let me clarify that real quick. The DHL Boeing followed TCAS and descended. It informed ATC, but the call was not registered. The Bashkirian airline complied with the very late instructions of the controller and therefore descended as well. Whilst the Boeing had no information on where traffic is, the Tupolev had a wrong information. 9 seconds before the planes collided, it was the co-pilot in the back seat of the Tupolev who eventually identified that the Boeing was on the left side. 2 seconds before the collision, the flight data recorder of the Tupolev recorded the highest possible pitch-up movement of the steering column. The Boeing was, according to flight data, increasing the descent rate at the time. The steering column was in its maximum forward position, but it was simply too late.
Yeah, that's right. The planes collided precisely at 11:35 and 32 seconds at an altitude of 34,890 feet. The Tupolev was slightly higher, so the vertical stabilizer of the Boeing slid through the Tupolev's fuselage just before the wing section. The Bashkirian went down north of the town of Überlingen, whilst the Boeing came down 5 miles south in the vicinity of the community of Ovingen.
And there was no chance of survival in neither of the planes. The Tupolev was in two parts, and the Boeing was missing its vertical stabilizer, so they both were not controllable anymore. All 71 combined occupants of these planes died, including those kids from Russia who got this trip as a present for outstanding accomplishments in education. And if we look at everything we just discussed, we have to say that this was a disaster that could have been avoided multiple times, right?
Absolutely. There were so many mistakes made here. If just one of those would have not have occurred, it's pretty safe to say that the accident would not have happened. Most of those mistakes were on the ground, which is really, really rare, but also in both planes mistakes were made.
In Zurich, the investigation revealed that the way this ATC was operated was just not right in so many ways. In the first place, the controller should have never worked alone. But, Sebastian, a question to you now, is that, or does it happen sometimes that an air traffic controller works alone, or is that something that is strictly forbidden?
That's a question you cannot really answer in this particular situation for like all air traffic controls. There is approach controls, final controls on small airports where it's absolutely fine and absolutely normal that one controller is there alone. In a area control like this it was okay as well, but it shouldn't have happened. Like there was no legal issues with what they did here. It was pretty much more of a workload issue.
Okay.
Whilst the regular workload is totally manageable for one person, any special situation changed that immediately. In this particular case, it was the A320 bound for Friedrichshafen that completely distracted the controller.
Okay, yeah, that makes totally sense. And furthermore, the company did not have a good way of distributing relevant information. The fact that the controller tried to call Friedrichshafen via landline shows that he was not aware of all inoperative systems that night. And talking about the inoperative systems, if at least a landline backup would have been available, we can assume that the on-duty controller would have informed the controller on standby. This would have immediately resolved the situation, and even if not, with a working landline, Karlsruhe would have been able to warn Zurich on the topic. If the STCA had worked, the controller would have been acoustically informed of the conflict.
Yeah, right. Another huge factor was that TCAS procedures were not clarified at the time. The investigation showed that Bashkirian Airlines was using TCAS handbooks as well as their own corporate regulations. Those were differing in a very important part, you can say. Whilst TCAS documentation clearly stated that maneuvers contrary to TCAS advisories are forbidden, the Airline Operations Manual said that air traffic controllers are solely authorized to issue instructions. Therefore, the Bashkirian crew did in fact react according to their training. Eventually, they also made a mistake, though. The controller's advisory was to descend to flight level 350, but they kept on descending through that flight level. The collision occurred at 34,890 feet. If they had leveled off at 35,000 or flight level 350, this would have been a dangerous close call indeed, but not a collision at all. Same goes for the 757 crew, by the way. As stated before, the recommended sink rate for TCAS advisory is 2,500 to 3,000 feet per minute. The DHL Boeing only descended at 2,300. If they would have chosen a higher rate of descent, they would also have passed each other. So in conclusion, this tragedy was totally avoidable in many ways, what kind of even makes things worse, I believe. eventually it was a combination of mistakes and also a little bit of bad luck that took those 71 lives that night. The other hand side, it also shows how much must go wrong for a catastrophic result like this. Just to make that clear once more, if any of the just mentioned factors would have gone just slightly different, this accident would have never happened. Furthermore, with this conclusion, the story of the Überlingen mid-air collision is not over yet. The aftermath called for another victim of this accident almost 2 years later.
Yes, that's right. On February 24th in 2001, the responsible air traffic controller on duty on the day of collision is stabbed to death in front of his home in Switzerland. The assassin was identified as a Russian father of 2 who lost both his children and his wife in the Überlingen collision. He was immediately arrested and sentenced to 8 years of prison. The sentence was then overturned in an appeal, and he was eventually sentenced to 5 years and 3 months for manslaughter. After he served 2/3 of the sentence, he was released and went back to Russia, where he was celebrated as a hero who brought justice for those who lost their lives in the accident.
Yeah, well, that really is a weird part of that story. I would not really see the controller as a murderer in the first place. And the trial in Switzerland pretty much came also to that same conclusion. Charges for manslaughter were brought against a total of 8 Skyguide employees, including both controllers on duty and their supervisor. But in trial, only 4 executives were sentenced to probationary jail time. Both controllers were acquitted. The Russian father, on the other hand, clearly came to the home of the controller armed with a knife. I'm not perfectly aware of the Swiss jurisprudence, but here in Germany, that makes the murder a planned assassination and therefore homicide, not manslaughter. Also, I find it questionable to celebrate him as a hero later on. I understand that he had a terrible loss, but that does not give anyone the right of vigilant justice.
Yes, I totally agree. In my opinion, I don't see the air traffic controller as a murderer. It was nothing he did on purpose, and as terrible as it is to admit, mistakes happen. Also, air traffic controllers, they're only humans, and whether you are a pilot or an air traffic controller or whatever, mistakes can happen, unfortunately, and I think there will never be 100% safety that they won't happen.
That is right. Plus, I do think that we have to take into account here that it was not solely his fault. Like, we just spend a lot of time in explaining how complicated this accident was. And this is something I still read in the media to this very day. You know, they have headlines like, controller kills 71 people, something like that. It's just not right.
Yeah.
It is he made a mistake. He was not aware of the situation. That is correct. But there's so many security measures in place for that.
Absolutely.
That just totally went wrong. You know, so I just think it's really hard to focus the fault for this incident on one person, because this is one of the best examples where this just is not true.
I agree. And I also find it very questionable that he was celebrated as a hero in Russia, like you said. And also the fact that he was showing pictures of his dead children to and of his wife to the air traffic controller. And yeah, as well as the fact that he doesn't regret what he did until today. And of course, everyone would understand the anger and sorrow, but that doesn't justify the fact to do something like this. And like you said, it has been a chain of many unfortunate coincidences that happened that night, of technical problems, being the only air traffic controller, and misunderstandings.
Yeah, right. I just want to say maybe one more thing we didn't talk about. Interestingly, there were no immediate responses in terms of improvements in safety regulations in aviation right after this. Today, It is absolutely normal that TCAS advisories are above everything, like above every controller and about every personal idea, if you will, or whatever. This hasn't been in place at the time, but it was not brought through worldwide as an immediate consequence of this accident. And this is something that would not happen today anymore. If something like that happens today, and the German investigation board, the so-called BFU, would give out a safety recommendation like that, it would most likely immediately be followed. So this is just,
Yeah.
sort of summing it up.
Yeah. So, this is it. Our first topic on Air Incidents podcast comes to a close. It is a unique accident with a really sad aftermath. If you liked it, not liked it, have questions, or any form of feedback, please do not hesitate to contact us. Sebastian is now going to tell you how you can reach out to us.
I love to do so, Sarah. Thank you so much. We have several ways of contacting us. The first one is through email. Our email address is feedback@aircrashpodcast.de. Delta Echo. Please keep that in mind. It is a German email address. We're using one email address for both podcasts we're providing. Makes things a little easier for us. Air Incidents Podcast is on Facebook and on Instagram, and you'll find us on both with the handle Air Incidents Podcast. And you can send us a direct message there. You can send us an email. You can send us audio feedback, which is greatly appreciated. We love when somebody does it in the German version of this podcast. So if you just want to, record a little something for us, please feel free to do so. We will take some feedback and talk about it in the next episode. This is something we're going to do all the time in future. And if you like what you heard so far, I already briefly mentioned it in the beginning of this episode. I will now say it again. Air Incidents Podcast is on Patreon. You find us there at www.patreon.com/aircrashpodcast. We have several support packages there that give you some benefits, if you will. It's always a monthly subscription. I know that for those of you listening from the United States, that the Patreon in the United States has a per episode payment. Unfortunately, this is not offered in Germany yet, and I think due to legal issues, it won't come. So, it's a monthly subscription. You can either choose one of our packages or choose the pay what you want function. That would always be greatly appreciated. If you want to do a one-time donation, you'll find us on PayPal at www.paypal.me/aircrashpodcast. So as said, if you want to support us, we're very grateful, but keep in mind, the most important support for us is your feedback.
Yes!
So, our next episode will talk about a 2001 accident in New York that happened shortly after September 11th. The crash of American 587 in Queens. Sarah.
Yes, in 2001, an American Airlines Airbus A300 crashed into a residential area in Queens. 260 lives were lost that day. Due to the time of the crash, all of New York was in fear of a second terror attack. The actual cause, however, was way more complex and far away from terror.
Air Incidents Episode 2, Queens 2001, will be available on April 16th, 2021 on your favorite podcast app. Thank you very much for listening to today's show. We're looking forward to hear from you. And have a great time until April 16th. My name is Sebastian. I'm the host of this show. Joining me on the microphone, our beautiful, amazing, outstanding voice, lovely Sarah.
Okay, enough.
Have a great time. See you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Delta Papa Charlie, runway 18, 1320,
Runway 18 cleared to land, Delta Papa Charlie.